Today, we're looking at the development history of the chunky, heavily armed, 4-ton, flying anti-Japanese naval dump truck of destruction that was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. Perhaps the most famous Allied naval bomber of World War II, the SBD, which according to many American airmen stood for slow but deadly, put in some serious work during the Pacific campaigns. Not only did it sink more enemy warship tonnage during 1942 than all other Allied aircraft combined, but it was also the only US aircraft to take part in all 5 of the carrier-exclusive naval battles. And yet, when the Dauntless first entered service in 1940, nobody really expected it to achieve the greatness that it did. It was slow, heavy, woefully unprotected, and its replacement, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, was already in development. However, fate would intervene, and an aircraft that was only intended for frontline service until perhaps late 1941, early 1942, found itself being used throughout the majority of the Second World War. The result was that the SBD Dauntless had quite a protracted period of development, seeing several production models entering service, and each one being an improvement on the last, more or less. Indeed, the vast majority of Dauntlesses that would be built would not enter service until after the Battle of Midway, which is considered the most legendary action of the type's career. By that point, the aircraft was already on the road to becoming obsolete, but with the steady application of design improvements and a healthy dose of bravery from the men who flew it, the Dauntless carried on playing important roles in many of the naval battles throughout the Pacific War, right up until the beginning of 1945. Now, speaking of naval battles, today's video has been very kindly sponsored by World of Warships. World of Warships is a beautifully detailed naval combat game that lets you command some of history's most iconic warships. It offers several unique game modes to choose from, including intense player-versus-player battles and cooperative strategic operations. Now, with over 500 ships across 10 different nations to choose from, there is bound to be a ship that suits your playstyle. Be it the big guns of battleships, the aerial dominance of aircraft carriers, the versatility of cruisers, the speed of destroyers, or perhaps the sneaky stealth of submarines. Now, I think a lot of you may suspect I prefer aircraft carriers, but I'm actually a battleship player through and through. There's just something deeply satisfying about flinging 16-inch shells 20 kilometers downrange, piercing through an enemy's deck, and deleting their citadels. But regardless of your choice, each ship offers a unique experience, and each has been painstakingly detailed. Speaking of which, the graphics have also recently been updated as well, and I have to say, the dynamic weather and the new water effects look absolutely gorgeous. So to try out World of Warships today, click on the link in the description below and use the invite code BRAVO, and in doing so you'll get 7 days of premium account time, 1.5 million credits, 500 doubloons, and a choice of one of several iconic ships like the USS Phoenix or the HMS Wakeful after completing just 10 battles. So once again, thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring today's video. And now, let's take a closer look at the development of the SBD Dauntless. Now, before we begin, a very quick bit of housekeeping. Starting with today's video, most of my future deep dives are going to be split into 2 parts. There will be a video that covers the development history of the aircraft, and then one that covers its service history. There will be exceptions where I do just one longer video that covers both, and this will usually be for aircraft that were only built in small numbers, like the Dornier DOX for example. But for major production aircraft of World War II, and the Cold War, yes, I am finally going to start covering jets, I promise, I know I've been saying it for years, it's going to be this new 2-part format. I'm doing this for a few reasons, mostly to preserve my own sanity. It helps to keep the videos concise, it streamlines my workload, particularly from a research perspective, and honestly, a lot of these aircraft have such rich and storied service histories, often in multiple theaters, that a dedicated video exploring that topic is absolutely mandatory. Now, I will still briefly touch on an aircraft's service history during the development videos, just to give context as to why certain design changes were made, but on the whole, it will now be segregated into this two-video format. So, how was the Douglas SBD Dauntless developed? Well, its origins go back to the early 1930s, but they don't begin with the Douglas Aircraft Company, at least not directly. Instead, things began at the Northrop Corporation, the first Northrop Corporation, which Jack Northrop had set up with the financial assistance of Donald Douglas. The SBD Dauntless began life as the Northrop XBT-1, which was developed in 1934. It was part of a new generation of dive bombers ordered by the US Navy, and it would be the first of its class to be considered wholly effective. Let me explain. By the early 1930s, the use of dive bombers had been a core part of US naval doctrine for a couple of years now. Experiments conducted in the 1920s had demonstrated the effectiveness of this sort of attack against enemy warships, and there was now a growing camp of officers within the US Navy that believed the dive bomber could eventually match or even exceed the effectiveness of the torpedo bomber. But there were limitations that had to be addressed before the dive bomber could achieve its full potential. The same experiments that highlighted its strengths also exposed some significant weaknesses. Firstly, there was the problem that the current dive bombers in service were unable to conduct a fully or near-vertical dive bombing attack. If such a maneuver was attempted, the airframe often struggled to cope with the high diving speeds, or the control surfaces became ineffective, or both, and this often had a fatal ending for the pilot. Secondly, there was the added complication that in steep dives, when a bomb was released, it may strike the aircraft's propeller or the fixed landing gear. At the time, these bombs had short-release armed fuses, which meant that if the bomb struck the plane with enough force, it would detonate. And thirdly, even if everything in a dive bombing attack went according to plan, without the aircraft exploding or falling to bits, the bombs currently available for use were not capable of penetrating the armoured decks of heavier cruisers or capital ships. This meant that early dive bombers were restricted to dive attack angles of no greater than 45 degrees, and their primary targets would be destroyers, light cruisers, or auxiliary ships. Unless things changed, torpedo bombers would still have to be used against heavy cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, and the dive bomber would be relegated as a lighter attack aircraft. Individually, these problems were gradually solved between 1930 and 1933. More powerful engines allowed dive bombers to carry the newer and much larger 500 or 1,000 pound bombs. At terminal velocity, and with delayed fuses, these could pierce through the armoured decks of warships by sheer dint of mass. To solve the bomb colliding with airplane problem, a pivoted dive bombing crutch was developed, which was a hinged mechanism that swung the bomb down and away from both the propeller disc and the fixed landing gear. And, to solve the whole aircraft breaking apart in a steep dive problem, engineers at NACA and at other aircraft firms began to develop various types of dive brakes. This was made especially easy with the gradual emergence of the all-metal monoplane, which was far more suited to this sort of equipment. Collectively, these improvements radically improved the potential of dive bombing aircraft, and they would form the core of US Navy requirements when new specifications were issued at the start of 1934. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics called for two new types of dive bombing aircraft to be developed. First, there was the Scout Bomber, which was designated VSB, which would have a maximum weight of 5,000 pounds and be able to carry the 500-pound bomb. Second, there was the Dive Bomber, designated VB, which would have a maximum weight of 6,000 pounds and be able to carry the heavier 1,000-pound bomb. As an aside, the VB and VSB designations would later be combined, with SB being the new designation for all single-engine dive bombers operated by the US Navy. Both designs were to be capable of carrier-based operations. They would have a stalling speed of no greater than 65 miles per hour, and they were to be equipped with the new bomb crutches and dive brakes. Though the monoplane was beginning to establish a firmer presence in the field of military aviation, the Navy did not stipulate this configuration as a mandatory requirement. Indeed, owing to the complexities of their requirements, they were prepared to accept multiple types of aircraft into service. That way, if one type failed, others could simply have their production increased to make up the numbers. Eventually, 6 manufacturers submitted proposals. There were 3 biplanes and 3 monoplanes. For the biplanes, there was the Curtiss SBC-3, which would be ordered as a stopgap measure and enter service as the Helldiver, a name which is confusingly recycled several times in various dive bomber aircraft developed by that company. Then there was the Great Lakes XB-2G, which was an updated version of the BG-1, which, though innovative, did not receive a production order. And then there was the Grumman XSBF-1, which had inferior performance to both. In contrast, all 3 of the monoplane submissions would eventually receive production orders, but each design experienced a very different level of success, or failure. There was the Brewster XSBA-1, which, due to delays, was not ordered until 1938, and then, due to more delays, did not enter service until 1941. Only 30 were built, and the least said about this monstrosity, the better I feel. Then there was the Vought XSBTU-1, which would be ordered into service as the Vought Vindicator, the Navy's first monoplane dive bomber. But its success was limited. The design was a mixed mash of old and new technology, and the type would only see limited wartime service. And finally, there was the Northrop XBT-1, which itself was ordered into service as well, but would also go on and evolve into the Douglas SBD Dauntless. The XBT-1 was designed by engineer Ed Heinemann at Northrop's facility in El Segundo, California, and it signaled the start of a whole lineage of designs that would make Heinemann a household name in the field of aeronautical engineering. Though the designs proposed by Brewster and Vought both had better predicted performance, the Bureau of Aeronautics saw greater long-term promise in Northrop's design, as it was more advanced on paper, and because of this, a prototype was ordered under contract on the 12th of November 1934. Operated by a 2-man crew, a pilot and an observer, the XBT-1 was an all-metal cantilever monoplane. A dominating feature of the design was the use of a multicellular wing structure. This replaced the traditional spars and ribs with a crisscrossed framework of box-like aluminium cells. This allowed for a wing to be built without struts or bracing while maintaining a high degree of strength, but it did come with a compromise. The internal layout of the wing precluded any recesses to be installed for a fully retractable undercarriage, and so the landing gear partially retracted into streamlined fairings instead. This wing structure also prevented the installation of a wing folding mechanism. Though this wasn't a mandatory requirement for the US Navy at this time, it was highly desirable, as it allowed more aircraft to be stored aboard aircraft carriers. And to compensate for this, the XBT-1 was designed to be as compact as possible. It only had a wingspan of 41 feet 6 inches. It was 31 feet 6 inches long and just 12 feet 6 inches high. This gave it a chunky, frumpy appearance, especially with those unappealing landing gear fairings, and the thick chord narrow wings was something of a hallmark of the design and something that would be carried over into the SBD Dauntless. Designed for the heavier dive bombing role, the XBT-1 could carry a single 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage, plus 2 smaller 100-pound bombs underneath the wing. For defense, it was only built with a single forward-firing 30 caliber machine gun, which was operated by the pilot, apparently leaving the rear completely defenseless. But this was only for the prototype. For the production model, it was intended for the installation of a flexibly mounted 30 caliber machine gun in the rear. A more powerful gun armament had been contemplated, but as the design team was struggling to keep the aircraft below the Navy's weight limit of 6,000 pounds, this line of thought was eventually abandoned. To facilitate dive bombing attacks, Ed Heinemann and his team developed a new multi-purpose flap system. These were huge hinged split flaps. The lower flap was extended for takeoff and landing, while both could be deployed as an enormous air brake. The development of this system was not without its problems. In early test flights of the XBT-1, in which Ed Heinemann himself rode along as an observer, the prototype experienced severe buffeting when the dive flaps were extended. As it so happened, these flaps caused huge vortices to form behind the wing when deployed, which subsequently interfered with the air flowing over the tail control surfaces. This buffeting became progressively worse as the aircraft entered steeper and steeper dives, and at the end of some of the test flights, Ed Heinemann would emerge from the cockpit looking visibly shaken. Following consultations with engineers from NACA, or NACA, however you want to pronounce it these days, the solution to the problem was quite simple, and that was to cut 3-inch holes along the whole length of the flap system. Not only did this make the aircraft look like a flying cheese grater, but it was now a stable flying cheese grater as well. And the perforated flap system would go on to become a symbol of the entire SBD lineage. Completed in July of 1935, the XBT-1 made its first flight on August the 19th, flown by test pilot Vance Breeze. Aside from the aforementioned problems with the flap system, the early test flights highlighted a series of issues that had to be resolved if the type were to be successful. An early complaint was that it was underpowered. Initially, it was completed with a Pratt & Whitney R1535-66 Twin Wasp Jr., a twin-row 14-cylinder radial that put out around 750 horsepower. This drove a two-blade fixed-pitch propeller, and it only pushed the aircraft to a pitiful top speed of 184 miles per hour. In December 1935, it was replaced with the -94 version of the engine, which produced 825 horsepower. This increased the top speed to 212 miles an hour and allowed a service ceiling of 22,500 feet with a full combat load. This was a more respectable pace, but still considered a little too slow. However, the design team was more focused on solving another, slightly more alarming problem that had emerged, and that was something called engine torching. The carburetor of the engine struggled to cope with the changes in barometric pressure as the aircraft performed high-speed vertical dives from altitude. Unspent fuel was pumped out of the exhaust manifolds, and it would ignite as it exited the exhaust below the fuselage. This meant that every time the prototype entered into a dive, it grew a 30-foot-long tail of flame, one that apparently burned hot enough to scorch the paintwork off its underside. Now, when the aircraft wasn't trying to self-immolate like a drunken wizard who cast fireball in a broom closet, it also proved to be equally problematic with ice. Cold weather tests showed that the expansion of ice around the cockpit frame cracked the plastic panels. The heating system was considered by pilots to be a suggestion rather than an effective piece of equipment, and ice buildup in the landing gear fairings caused the wheels to be frozen in the retracted position. This meant that the pilot had to circle the airfield at low altitude and hope the ice melted before he ran out of fuel. Eventually, all these problems were more or less sorted, and as an aside here, a huge amount of respect to test pilot Vance Breeze and his colossal stones, as he had to conduct over 100 flame-producing dives before the issue with the carburetor was finally solved. And by the summer of 1936, the Navy's dive bomber competition had evolved into a two-plane race, one between the designs submitted by Northrop and Vought. In the end, it decided to order both aircraft into production, and Northrop would receive an order for 54 BT-1s on September 18, 1936. Production BT-1s retained the same engine as the prototype, but thanks to minor tweaks in the design of the airframe, the overall performance had increased, despite the aircraft becoming over 400 pounds heavier. It had a gross weight of just under 7,000 pounds, but it managed to achieve a top speed of 222 miles an hour at 9,500 feet. Despite this improvement, the BT-1 itself was not a popular aircraft. Entering service in 1937 with squadrons VB5 and VB6 aboard the carriers Yorktown and Enterprise, it quickly earned the reputation of being a widowmaker. A lack of pre-production testing had failed to highlight a litany of vicious handling characteristics. This included a loss of rudder effectiveness at low speeds, not ideal for takeoff or landing on carriers, a loss of aileron effectiveness at low speeds, also not ideal for takeoff or landing on carriers, and, worst of all, a proclivity to enter a sudden snap roll if power was applied too suddenly, especially at low speeds, which, surprise surprise, was not ideal for taking off or landing aboard an aircraft carrier. Following several unsurprising and tragic fatal accidents, it was clear that the Navy would not follow up with any more orders for the BT-1 unless there were dramatic improvements. But even before the first deliveries had been made in 1937, Ed Heinemann and his design team had already been hard at work. Of the 54 production BT-1s, the last 2 that were built were retained as experimental aircraft. One was used to test the development of a nose-wheel tricycle landing gear, and the other became the XBT-2. There was then an important development. In September 1937, following internal conflicts and labour disputes, the Northrop Corporation was dissolved by its parent company, Douglas, and its facilities now became the El Segundo division of the Douglas Aircraft Company. Ed Heinemann, who had worked with Douglas before, was retained as its chief engineer, and he and Donald Douglas both agreed that the BT-1 was not yet a lost cause. The original prototype contract issued to Northrop had included a clause which allowed the production of a second prototype if needed, and Douglas Aircraft successfully applied to have this granted. The transformation of the XBT-2 into the Douglas SBD-1 happened over a remarkably short period of time, just 13 months, considering it was more or less a complete redesign. This was not only a testament to the dedication of the engineering team at El Segundo, but also the desperation of the US Navy. Both the Northrop BT-1 and the Vought SB2U were underperforming, and this left the Navy without a viable dive bomber in a world that was rapidly rearming. The second prototype made its maiden flight on the 22nd of April 1938. In this first flight, it was still essentially a Northrop BT-1 that had just been pulled from the production line, but that soon changed. Most of its problems appeared to stem from a severe lack of power, which was then confirmed when it suffered a belly landing following a stall in May. The 825 horsepower Twin Wasp was subsequently torn out and replaced by a Wright R1820 Cyclone. Sources do conflict on the exact type and power output of the Cyclone, with some saying 950 horsepower and others 1,000, but this engine, combined with a new 3-blade variable pitch propeller, was expected to yield results. Unfortunately, said results were mediocre at best, and the aircraft only saw a minor increase in performance. Unwilling to give up, Heinemann sent the prototype to NACA's wind tunnel facility in Langley for a thorough examination. Following a series of full-scale tests, he was given a list of recommended changes, most of which were then carried out. The first change was the deletion of the semi-retractable landing gear and the drag-inducing fairings. A new fully retractable system was installed, with the undercarriage folding inwards to sit in a recess where the wing root met with the fuselage. Various lines and bumps considered offensive to the gods of airflow were then smoothed out. The wings were redesigned, with anti-stall letterbox slots next to the leading edges added in, as were the split flaps, and the tail and rudder was redesigned and enlarged to compensate for some lateral instability. This modification program required extensive testing, and Ed Heinemann and his team tested no less than 21 different sets of tail surfaces in a 6-month period alone. In the end, the only recommended change that wasn't implemented was the deletion of the perforated dive brakes, as NACA had reversed their earlier recommendation on the grounds of improving the aircraft's top speed. Ed Heinemann, having experienced the tail buffeting situation firsthand, and not wishing to subject naval aviators to the same fate, told NACA very politely to stuff it and retain them anyway. It was in this form, more or less, that the prototype was then put through its major naval evaluations, and now, with company changes finalized, it was officially redesignated as the Douglas SBD-1. The change in engine, combined with the various aerodynamic improvements, yielded the results that Ed Heinemann and the Navy were looking for. The prototype had an improved top speed of 265 miles per hour, a service ceiling of just over 30,000 feet, and significantly improved low-speed handling. The only major complaint that remained was that the aircraft had a very small operational range of just 604 miles. Ideally, the Navy wanted a range of at least 1,400 miles for a carrier-based dive bomber. Douglas assured the Bureau of Aeronautics that such a range could be achieved, if further modifications and a few compromises were permitted, but even if it could not, the Navy was getting desperate, and on the 8th of July 1939, the type was ordered into production as the Douglas SBD-1 Dauntless. Initially, the production order was for just 36 aircraft, but this was increased to 144 following the German invasion of Poland. Of this number, 57 would be built as the SBD-1, and the rest as the improved SBD-2. At a glance, the SBD-1 bore a familiar resemblance to the prototype, but in reality it incorporated a number of modifications. The engine was now a 1000 horsepower -32 version of the Wright Cyclone. It came with a redesigned cowling, a propeller spinner, and on the top it had a pronounced carburetor air intake, which made it easy to distinguish. The cockpit was redesigned with a continuous transparent canopy, with one fixed and 3 sliding segments to enclose the pilot and the observer/radio operator/tail gunner. He was becoming a very busy boy. The pilot was given an Aldous telescopic sight to help with bomb aiming, and for carrier landings he could now make use of an enlarged arrestor hook. A big complaint about the BT-1 had been its tendency to bounce and miss the arrestor cable, and the enlarged hook was considered an absolute necessity. Additionally, the pilot's controls were now duplicated in the rear cabin. This allowed the crew to share the load during longer distance missions, and more importantly, it gave the rear crew member some modicum of control should the pilot become incapacitated or killed. Defensive armament remained a single 30 cal machine gun, for now, but the forward-firing armament was doubled to 2 fuselage-mounted 50 caliber machine guns. These were installed in the front of the cockpit, with the breeches protruding inside, which allowed the pilots to clear out any jams. Other changes included the moving of the radio mast further aft, a 1-foot increase in height, a 5 square foot increase in wing area, and the addition of auxiliary fuel tanks in the center sections of the wings. This increased fuel tankage by 30 US gallons, and boosted the range up to 860 miles. Still wasn't what the Navy wanted, but improvement was improvement. Unfortunately, said improvement came at a cost, added weight, and that had a negative impact on its performance. The top speed was reduced from 265 to 253 miles per hour, the climb rate was reduced, the service ceiling was reduced, and the landing forces subjected to the aircraft were of course increased. The result was that although the Navy was now taking deliveries of a modern monoplane dive bomber, the first arriving in spring 1940, and one capable of carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, it didn't really want to use it, especially as Douglas was now working on an improved version, the SB-2. Additionally, early reports coming out of Europe indicated that the SBD's lack of armor plating, or any self-sealing fuel tanks, might negatively impact its survivability. Though, of course, at this point the US was still trying to at least publicly display its neutrality, as far as Europe was concerned, never mind the blossoming bromance between Roosevelt and Churchill. And as far as Japan was concerned, reports were only just reaching the US Navy about a new combat aircraft being sighted over the skies of China. Supposedly, Japan had developed a new carrier-borne monoplane fighter, one armed with cannons. But many in the US Navy would not take this new machine seriously until it appeared above the skies of Pearl Harbor, Midway Atoll, and the Philippines, to name a few. For now, the Mitsubishi A6M0 would not be considered a credible threat. Putting aside the fatal mistake of underestimating one's opponent, the US Navy was at least sensible enough to see that the SBD-1 wasn't quite up to the task of frontline duties. Survivability aside, the range was actually the biggest issue, even with the auxiliary fuel tanks. Carrier airstrikes take time, and time requires fuel, lots of it. Considering how long it took for a carrier air wing to launch, form up with other aircraft, travel to the target, attack the target, travel home, and then land in pattern, it was estimated that the SBD-1 had a combat radius of less than 200 nautical miles, which frankly was pathetic. And so, the US Navy decided it wasn't going to use its 57 SBD-1s as carrier-based dive bombers at all, and instead, it disposed of them per its modus operandi for dispensing with any equipment it deemed inadequate. It gave them to the Marines. Now, as mentioned before, the remaining 87 aircraft from the initial production order of 144 were delivered as the improved SBD-2. Though it didn't address all the inadequacies of the SBD-1, it did at least offer significantly improved range. The two 15-gallon auxiliary fuel tanks were removed, and a pair of larger 65-gallon tanks were installed in the outer wing sections. This took total fuel tankage up to 310 gallons, and the range shot up to 1,200 nautical miles. Aside from the addition of an autopilot system, considered essential for long-distance navigation over the ocean, and a slightly smaller carburetor air intake, the SBD-2 featured no other changes, not even to the power plant. The added weight of the extra fuel had a negative impact on performance, and in the field this was sometimes rectified by the crews making a field modification which involved removing one of the forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns and its ammunition. It was a compromise between performance and firepower that not everyone was in universal agreement on, and this modification was not done to every SBD-2 in service. It really came down to the individual crews on individual carriers. More improvements could have been made to the SBD-2, but as Douglas was obligated to fulfill its original order for 144 planes by a certain date, there simply wasn't enough time to do so. However, the type was still considered adequate enough for frontline service, and the first aircraft were delivered to VB-2 and VS-2 aboard the carrier USS Lexington in November of 1941. Deliveries to VS-6 and VS-6 aboard Enterprise followed a month later. Consequently, it was the SBD-2 that saw the type's combat debut during the Pacific War, not counting the SBD-1s of the Marines that were destroyed on the ground during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Most notably, the SBD-2 played a key part in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the world's first carrier-versus-carrier engagement. It was here that the Dauntlesses of USS Enterprise and Yorktown, assisted by TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, committed the act of seal clubbing the Japanese light carrier Shoho. In total, she was struck by 13 armor-piercing bombs and at least 7 torpedoes, becoming the first carrier to be sunk by the US Navy during the war. Though Coral Sea was a success for the Dauntless, it had also highlighted the need for improvement. Early combat losses were high, and this, combined with combat reports from other types operated by the fleet, reinforced the need to improve survivability, and this would drive many of the changes that would be found in the SBD-3. The SBD-3 actually began life as a model that was ordered for the French Navy, who placed an order for 174 airframes. But following the collapse of France, and only seeing lukewarm interest being expressed by the British, the US Navy took over the order and then increased it by an additional 410 SBDs. First delivered to frontline units in the spring of 1943, the SBD-3 was the first variant of the Dauntless that was truly suitable for frontline operations in the Pacific. Which was lucky, as it would take part in one of the most important naval engagements of the Second World War, the Battle of Midway. Visually, the SBD-3 was almost identical to its predecessor, the only distinguishing feature being a slightly larger engine ventilation slot, but internally a lot had changed. The SBD-3 featured all of the improvements that should have been seen on the SBD-2. Self-sealing fuel tanks were installed as standard. The crew was protected by armor plating. The windscreen now had a bulletproof front panel, and the removed forward-firing 50 caliber machine gun was reinstalled. Its defenses would also see an upgrade. Not long into its service life, the SBD-3 often had a second defensive gun installed by the crews, who preferred the extra firepower against the marauding Japanese Zeros. This field modification proved to be effective, and later examples of the SBD-3 would be built with two defensive 30 caliber weapons as standard. This required little modifications to the design, and the only change was the sliding door panel that covered the guns when they were not in use. Of course, and once again, all of these changes added extra weight to the airframe. And although the SBD-3 had a new model of the Wright Cyclone, the -52 version, its power output was more or less the same. To prevent any further loss in performance, attempts were then made to offset this weight increase. The duralumin skin of the aircraft was replaced by thinner all-clad sheeting, and its emergency flotation equipment was removed. This saved approximately 180 pounds in weight, but even so, the total gross weight of the SBD had now exceeded 10,000 pounds. Indeed, later on, questions would be asked as to whether it was even appropriate to remove the emergency flotation equipment in the first place, considering the number of Dauntlesses that would eventually be lost due to ditching in the ocean. Though the overall performance of the SBD did suffer a bit due to the modifications made, the drop in the top speed was actually less than expected, with a loss of just 2 miles per hour, and the range had indeed increased, with the SBD being able to operate with a range of just under 1,400 miles. Though its straight-line performance did leave much to be desired, indeed, some airmen had nicknamed the Douglas the slow but deadly Dauntless, many were now satisfied with the overall direction that the design of the aircraft had taken. This was especially fortuitous, as it appeared that by mid-1942, the SBD would have to remain in use far longer than expected. The US Navy had hoped to replace it with the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, but as many of you would know from the video that I've already made on that aircraft, it had its fair share of technical difficulties, several hundred to be exact. Its entry into service would thus be significantly delayed, and this forced the US Navy to continue to rely on the Douglas SBD, already considered half obsolete, during the most critical period of the Pacific War. But if any officers had any lingering doubts about the type's potential effectiveness, they would be erased during the morning of June 4th, 1942, at the Battle of Midway. At approximately 10:25 am, SBDs from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese carrier strike force, which consisted of the fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and their escorting warships. It took a while for the Dauntlesses to get there, partly because they were slow, partly because some missed the fleet when it made a 90-degree turn, but mostly because they took their time gaining valuable altitude. Meanwhile, the initial attacks by other aircraft, such as the TBD Devastator, met with horrific losses due to heavy Japanese fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire. But these early assaults served to draw the Japanese air cover down to sea level, leaving their carriers vulnerable to the approaching Dauntless dive bombers. With their decks crowded with refueling and rearming aircraft, the Japanese carriers were now highly exposed. The dive bombers began their near-vertical attack from around 20,000 feet, releasing their bombs at low altitudes for maximum accuracy. Within minutes, the Dauntlesses scored direct hits on 3 of the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The bombs triggered massive explosions and uncontrollable fires, crippling the carriers beyond repair. Later in the day, the Yorktown launched another wave of SBDs that successfully located and hit the Hiryu, the last operational carrier still around Midway. By the end of the day, Hiryu was also engulfed in flames, forcing the Japanese to scuttle her. Within a few brief hours, the SBD Dauntless had destroyed almost 50% of Japan's total fleet carrier tonnage. It had changed the course of the Pacific War, and it had cemented itself as a US naval legend. More details on this famous engagement, and others involving the Dauntless and the brave men who flew it, will be covered in the video on its service history. Now, while the SBD-3 was busy earning itself a legendary reputation at the Battle of Midway, another example of the Dauntless was struggling. The US Army Air Corps, which at best had shown only a mild interest in dive bombers during the interwar years, suddenly took an active interest in their use following the dramatic successes of dive bombers operated by the German Luftwaffe in its conquest of Europe. Unfortunately for the US Army, it had no time to actually try and develop dive bombers for itself, so instead it decided to try and poach some from the US Navy, and it succeeded. In July of 1940, several SBD-1s were loaned to the Army by the Marine Corps, probably with a sigh of relief, and they were evaluated by the 24th Bombardment Squadron. Despite having no other dive bombers to evaluate against it, the Army deemed that the SBD would be acceptable, at least until the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver became available, which it would also try and steal from the Navy. It then requested that 168 SBD-3s from the Navy production order be diverted for use by the Army Air Corps, a request which was granted despite some heavy objections, as the Navy was desperately trying to replace the SBD-1 and SBD-2. Entering service under the designation of A-24 Banshee, the Army version only differed from the Naval SBD in minor details. The tailhook was removed, the small rubber tailwheel was replaced by a larger pneumatic tailwheel, and the cabin featured Army instrumentation and radio equipment. The Banshee was only ever intended to be a stopgap measure until the Curtiss Helldiver entered service, but with Helldiver production being delayed, the Army was forced to rely on it during the opening months of war with Japan. This also meant that the Army had to take more SBDs from Navy production orders to fill its requirements, which led to no small amount of wrangling as each service became somewhat desperate for more and more strike aircraft. Eventually, the Army would operate the A-24, the A-24A, which was the Navy's new SBD-4, and the A-24B, which was the Navy's even newer SBD-5. Unfortunately, it was somewhat wasted effort, as these aircraft were never used to their full potential. In early campaigns over the Philippines and New Guinea, they were often sent into battle without adequate fighter support, and often in the hands of pilots with little or no experience in dive bombing or dive bombing training. In their first months of service, the 91st Bombing Squadron, operating the A-24, reported, and I quote, "a spectacular lack of success." This led to the type being mostly withdrawn from frontline use by the end of 1942, and of the almost 1,000 A-24s supplied for the Army, most would be retained on the US mainland as training or instructional airframes. Returning now to the US Navy, the aforementioned SBD-4 began to enter service with carrier squadrons towards the end of 1942. The most notable difference was an internal upgrade. The electrical system was changed from 12 volts to 24 volts. This allowed for the installation of additional radio navigation aids and airborne radar. Unfortunately, due to equipment shortages, early SBD-4s did not come from the factory with this radar installed, and most of the radar-equipped SBD-4s operated by the Navy were in fact retrofitted later at field modification stations. And when the radar system was installed on the Dauntless, it was easily distinguished courtesy of the Yagi antennas that had to be installed under each wing. Another change in the SBD-4 was the replacement of the earlier variable pitch propeller and spinner with a new spinnerless Hamilton Standard hydromatic constant speed propeller. Unlike the previous models, most of the SBD-4s would be delivered to the Marines or land-based Navy squadrons. This was because the aircraft's non-folding wings would become a liability if it was used on the smaller-decked light and escort carriers. The only light carrier that could safely accommodate the Dauntless was the USS Independence, where Squadron VB-22 flew SBD-4s against targets in Marcus, Wake, and Tarawa in late 1943. Later on, they would switch over to the TBM Avenger. The SBD-4 would also see some extensive action in the South Pacific during the early stages of the Solomons campaign. Compared to previous models of the Dauntless, the SBD-4 was built and operated in large numbers, with 780 being delivered to the US Navy between October of 1942 and April of 1943. This number probably would have been higher, as Douglas was well and truly on its wartime footing by this point, had production not rapidly shifted over to the new SBD-5. This was the penultimate model, and it was the one that was built in the largest numbers. The SBD-5 brought a much-needed, though modest, boost in power with the installation of a 1200 horsepower variant of the Cyclone engine. Despite this upgrade, the increase in weight from additional modifications meant that the top speed only improved by about 7 miles per hour, whilst the cruising speed actually decreased. Visually, there was little difference between the SBD-4 and SBD-5. The most noticeable change was the replacement of the outdated 3-power telescopic sight, which often fogged up due to altitude changes during dives, and this was replaced with the modern Mark 8 reflector gun sight. Incidentally, owing to the aforementioned fogging issue, a windscreen heater was also installed to help overcome this. Other changes on the SBD-5 included the removal of the air intake scoop on the top of the engine cowling, the reduction of cowl flaps to 1 on each side, and moving the engine ventilation slot further back, making it slightly larger at the same time. The wings were also fitted with wet points, which allowed the aircraft to carry a pair of 58-gallon drop tanks. This allowed the aircraft's reconnaissance range to increase to almost 1,500 nautical miles. Entering service rapidly in 1943, the SBD-5 became the main production model, with 2,965 aircraft being built between February of 1943 and April of 1944. With the delay of the SB-2C Helldiver entering service, and oh my how that saga dragged on, it became the primary aircraft of the fleet's dive bomber squadrons when the aircraft carriers of the US Navy resumed their offensive campaigns in the later half of 1943. And the slow but deadly Dauntless would play a key role as the US Navy began its long campaign of island hopping its way towards the Japanese home islands. SBDs would play a crucial role during the Guadalcanal campaign, operating from both American carriers and from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal itself. They were highly effective against Japanese ships that didn't manage to leave New Georgia Sound, also known as the Slot, by daylight. Among their successes, SBDs sank the Japanese carrier Ryujo near the Solomon Islands on August the 24th and damaged 3 other carriers over the 6-month campaign. They also sank a cruiser and 9 transports during the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, also known as the 3rd and 4th Battles of Savo Island, or the Battle of the Solomons, or the Battle of Friday the 13th, or the Night of the Big Guns. Honestly, for more details, I recommend you just go and watch Drakini Fell's wonderful 8-part video series. As the scope of the US naval campaign expanded, obsolete models of the Dauntless would find themselves being used in auxiliary roles, mostly as trainers, but some were converted into medium-range reconnaissance aircraft. These were fitted with long-range radios, cameras, and other photographic equipment, and they were designated as the SBD-1P, 8 aircraft being converted, the SBD-2P, 15 aircraft converted, the SBD-3P, 47 aircraft converted, and the SBD-4P, with 16 aircraft being converted. By 1944, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver was finally beginning to replace the Dauntless in fleet service. The SBD-5s were phased out from carrier operations and were moved over to land bases, where they continued to deliver effective strikes against enemy targets for the rest of the Pacific War. Despite being replaced on the carriers, the Dauntless continued to prove its worth in various ground attack roles, contributing significantly to marine island invasion efforts until the very end of its service. In consequence of its obsolescence, the final variant of the Dauntless, the SBD-6, was barely deployed to the Pacific at all. The SBD-6 looked almost identical to the SBD-5. It did feature a more powerful 1350 horsepower-66 Cyclone engine, but this upgrade only boosted the top speed back up to 262 miles per hour, which meant that on paper it was technically slower than the old SBD-1, despite having over 400 horsepower more. This increase was not good enough, and fell way below the new standards that the Navy had set out by 1943. In consequence of this, only 450 SBD-6s would be built before all the remaining orders were cancelled. By the time the first were delivered to the US Navy on March 18, 1944, the Helldiver was already replacing it aboard aircraft carriers in the Pacific. As a result, most SBD-6s would be kept in the United States. They were used in coastal patrol squadrons, some were used as trainers for dive-bombing crews, some were used as towing targets, and others were used as utility or instructional airframes. And that wraps up the development history of the Douglas SBD Dauntless. In the not-so-distant future, we'll take an in-depth look at the type's service history, and to be honest, that's probably going to be a much longer video if I'm not careful about it. By the end of its production run in 1944, just under 6,000 of these slow but deadly aircraft had been built, and like anything built in such numbers, it had a very diverse operational record. But for now, if you want to learn a bit more about the development and technical aspects of the Douglas SBD, I can recommend the following books and documents. Firstly, from the Putnam collection of aeronautical books, we have McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Since 1920, Volume 1, by René Francion. This covers all the aircraft built by Douglas, along with the early Northrop designs when it was a Douglas subsidiary, and it has some great sections on the Northrop BT, the Douglas SBD, and the A-24, and it provides details on production and serial numbers. Then we have SBD Dauntless in Action by Squadron Signal Publications. This provides an excellent all-around account of the aircraft's development, and goes into some general details on its service history. It's definitely more geared towards technical and visual details, and it's perfect if you're into scale modelling. Now, if you're looking to research the SBD in a bit more detail, I can heartily recommend Douglas SBD Dauntless by Peter Smith. This covers the origins, the development, and the operational history of the aircraft in great detail. It also discusses the tactics employed by SBD squadrons, and provides technical explanations on how dive-bombing attacks were carried out. I also recommend, if you can find it, a copy of the SBD Pilot's Handbook. A few different examples can be found, most either for the SBD-5 or the SBD-6, and they provide a tremendous technical overview of the SBD from the pilot's perspective. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. I hope you like this new deep dive format, and I hope it's going to work well in the future, as it's certainly streamlined my workload quite a bit. I also think it's going to make it easier for people to absorb all of the history of major aircraft without me having to constantly bounce between technical stuff, then service history, then more technical stuff, then more service history. But anyway, let me know if you agree with this assessment. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. Now, I'm still looking at doing some live streaming stuff in the future, and I've put up a post on Patreon for people to suggest ideas or topics for a live stream format, so please feel free to post a suggestion if you haven't done so already. This totally isn't because I have the creative powers of a potato and can't think of anything that would actually be entertaining. No sir, not me. But anyways, once again, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.